Hey YouTube, this is Jaden coming at you in Team Shadow Strike, and this is going to be a deck discussional video over the Shadow Paladin Witches, because this deck, now that it is out, it is definitely going to be a threat, and it's definitely going to be causing some players a lot of grief, because we all know what the Witches do. They take grade zeros out of the drop zone and force them onto the field, so it forces you to have to replace them and waste more cards. So let's talk a little bit about this deck. So let's go down here. So as you can see, I did do a deck profile on this, so if you want to go check that out, be my guest. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the triggers, because this is where the most questions I get asked. Because the starter I use is Creeping Dark Goat, and some people, excuse me, they ask, why don't I use the Witch starter? Now the Witch starter, what she does is Forerunner, grade 1 rides, slide it anywhere you want. Whenever she boosts a successful attack, if your Vanguard was in Legion, you move it to the Soul, and then you can Superior Call any 2 grade 0s out of your deck. Now, I see the validity of why this card is good, because the idea is to get an early Legion with Fianna, use the skill to Counterblast 2 and look at the top 10 cards of your opponent's deck, attack for 25, attack hits, move it to the Soul, and Superior Call out 2 stand triggers, Soul Charge 2 and Unflip 2, and essentially get Fianna's skill off for free. So I do see why some people play the Witch starter, and maybe I'll test play it, but I just don't, I just don't see the validity of it that much, even though it is not bad. Some people don't like Goat because it costs a Counterblast, but it's kind of just, pick your poison there. So there really isn't a bad option here, because I've heard many different theories on why they play Witch. Well, they want to play an entire Witch deck. Well, it lets them unflip. Well, it lets them pull triggers out, and then you can just put them back in. I mean, a lot of other things. So it's pretty much up to you. Now, for the triggers, excuse me, guys, you can play... I play rainbow triggers. I play 4 crit, 4 draw, 4 stand, 4 heal. Now, there are some people that don't play the stands. They literally take the stands out and they play one of the Revenger crits, like Air Raid Dragon or Grim Revenger. They play one of those, and they play the 8 crit version. Now, that's not necessarily a bad idea, but the reason I like the stand triggers is, yeah, they do let you unflip. Yeah, they let you Soul Charge, but also I like it because it's just it's pretty cool, because if you start getting, well, I'll get to there in a second. But these do come in handy for something else. I'll get there. Now, for the grade 1s, some people, they do not like playing quintets in this deck, and the reason is because this deck counterblasts quite a bit. But I still like playing 1 quintet wall, just because if you do get it, you can get an early Legion off. Now, something my friend Sam told me that you guys need to keep in mind is we're now apparently no longer able to play mixed clans anymore. I mean, the only way that you can only do now is you can play a Majesty Lord Blaster deck with 4 Shadow Paladins in it. That's it. So, which means these have to be either Shadow Paladin Perfects or Shadow Paladin Quintets. You can't use the Witch Genesis Perfect anymore like this. But anyway, so... ignore that for right now. And he told me that just today. So, and then for the rest of the grade 1s, you're gonna see that most Witch players max out on the cards that do things that do the main function of the deck. So that's a gimme. So. And then the rest of the cards you can kind of just splash around. And the other grade 1 that I play is this, but we'll get to there in a second. So, this just kind of helps you set up for Legion. This is just an extra beater. But, you don't have to play quintets in this deck. I just play 1. And then, if you come over here to your grade 2s, we obviously are going to be playing 4 Fime, because it's not only our 12k attacker, it's the Legion mate for our boss monster. And then for our other one is we have this, which is the clone of our grade 1, that does essentially the same thing. You target a rear guard, Soul Blast 1 on your opponent's side of the field, obviously, and then you swap that card out with a grade 0 from the drop zone. One thing that you need to keep in mind is make sure that you always keep in mind what's in your opponent's drop zone, because you do not want, if you pay the cost in a tournament and you didn't prior check, then you don't get the cost back. That's your fault. I play Curse Lancers, so I can unflip, and now a lot of other people that ask me is why I only play one copy of Skull Witch Nemain. Now, I love Skull Witch Nemain. It's one of my favorite cards that there ever has been, because it's essentially a pot of greed, if you get that reference. But the problem is I do not want to have to ride this card. When I used to play old school Shadow Paladins, and I played 3 of this card, I essentially became very clear of how dangerous it is when you didn't open up with that Blaster Javelin to search out your Blaster Dark, and you had to ride this because you didn't have another grade 2. But Skull Witch Nemain is a good card, but if you ride this and your opponent is smart, they will rush the hell out of you. So that's why I only play 1. You can play 2. I wouldn't recommend any more than 2. 2 would be my limit, but that's me. So then, to the grade 3s, we really only have 2 grade 3s that, are considered our best ones. Our first one, obviously, is the one that everyone knows about, Witch Fime, otherwise known as the one that makes your opponent flip over the top 10 cards of their deck and legions with our 12k attacker Fime. Now, this can get extremely frustrating, because if you're facing this deck and you're almost scared to put up a field, because the second you call your key cards, your opponent is going to get rid of them. But one way to counter this deck, and I know this is very hard, is do not guard with your grade 0s unless you have to. And if you do, make sure you legion them right back as soon as you can, if that's possible, because the more grade 0s that you have present in your drop zone, the more fuel you give this deck. It's a catch-22, if you know what I mean. You have to guard attacks, but then they're just going to use those triggers and replace your key units with them. Your boosters and your 12k attackers and your other key units. They're just going to make you take them off the board, and like, say, just for argument's sake, say you had your 12k attacker over here, and then you had a decent Vanguard booster here. They're going to just say, okay, well, use the skills. Bam, bam. And now you have 2 grade 0s on your board. You lose 2 key units, and you now have to replace both these with something else by calling something over them, so technically you minus. That's why this deck can be such a pain in the butt. Because it literally causes you to minus from your hand more. But at the same time, if you are the one playing this deck, then you just have to learn to force your opponent to guard, because they can't just take every attack. Now, the other grade 3 witch is we have Reyes, and Reyes legions with Deidre. And what Reyes does... well, first let me say one more thing about Fianna. Fianna has kind of a mini Skull Witch built into her. That's why I think you can get away with only playing 1 Skull Witch Nemain, is because what she does is if your opponent has 2 grade 0s on their field, which is not hard to do to them, you can sacrifice a unit that is in your Vanguard circle and draw 2 cards. And by that means, if you have her as your Vanguard and your opponent has 2 grade 0s, you can sacrifice a Fianna or a Fime on your rear guard and draw 2 cards. So essentially you're doing this just without a counterblast. So that's why you can get away with playing 1 Skull Witch. Now for these, she has 2 skills. The first one is you can counterblast 1 and I think it's 1. No, it's counterblast 2, I'm sorry. You counterblast 2 and your opponent has to look at the top 5 cards of their deck, and superior call one of the triggers that they flip over, if they flip one over. And then the second skill is a Legion skill. When they Legion, you sacrifice one of your witches, and then for every grade 0 on your opponent's board, they lose 5,000 power. So what I essentially like to do is, let's say I have a field that looks like this. And then, let's see. let's say I have something like this. Let's say this is my field, all right? So I have this, and let's say I have 3 grade 0s on my opponent's board. And then next turn they retire one of those to replace it, and they want to save what hand they do, so they leave those other 2 there. That's when you can make a giant push by doing this. What you do is you ride Reyes. So you're going to have a new Vanguard, so your previous Legion, they both go to the Soul. Then you seek the mate again. Where is it? Where did she go? There she is. Seek the mate. Then what you do is you sacrifice a witch on your board, and your opponent loses 5,000 power for every grade 0 on their board. So say they have 2. That means their Vanguard loses minus 10,000 power. That is critical. Then, let's say we call a field back. Let's say we go, say we call another Cultist Witch and do that. Or, you know what, let's say we do something like this. Say we get something like this. Okay? Or, this is where this card comes in. Say after we sack that one witch, we call something here. That's where this card comes in. When she's called and your opponent has 2 grade 0s on the board and your Vanguard is in Legion, you can... and your Vanguard is in Legion, you can sacrifice a witch on your board, and your opponent's Vanguard loses 5,000 more power. So let's say call her, and we sacrifice this. Now our opponent's Vanguard loses another 5,000. So if they're an 11k Vanguard, that means they're negative 4,000. That is critical, guys. By having your opponent in the negative, that kills their defense. And then let's say we call this just so we have another boost. So if our opponent is at negative 4, they're getting ready to have to take all these attacks, a 16, a 27, and another 16. Let's say they're at 3 damage. They guard this one. Okay? Then let's say we go Legion attack for 27 at their negative 4. Well, they're going to take that one. That's where these come in. Let's say we check the Twin Drive. They're at 3 damage. First check. Critical trigger. Critical here. Power here. Second check. A stand trigger. Power here. Stand. So now, well, they're at 5 damage and say they only have 3 cards left. And they can maybe guard 1 attack. This has become 20. This has become 21. And this has become 14. 14 to negative 4. So now they have to take that 6 damage. That's why these stand triggers are good, because if you use her skill and then this skill to minus your opponent's Vanguard, it's going to hurt them if you hit a stand trigger, because that means that's another attack at a weakened Vanguard that will critically kill them by either killing off their resources in their hand, or it will just win you the game. I mean, there are things like what I just showed you here with this stand trigger. If you are fortunate enough to crit your opponent on this attack and then check a stand, you probably just won the game. Because even if your opponent does survive that turn, they're not going to have any cards left, and they're not going to have a way out. And by that time, you're going to have a field, you're going to have a hand, and they're not going to have a response. That's why the stand trigger in this deck is so crucial, because of Reyes. So, that's why the stand trigger is needed in this deck, because I think if you truly focus on this is the ultimate finisher. I mean, yes, Fianna is great, because Fianna carries draw power, and she lets you swap out your opponent's field, but, you know, Reyes with this skill, it will kill any hand. It will, any deck, it will, like, shut it down, because they will lose so much, and they will not be able to build a field presence back up. And even if they do, guess what, guys? Take away their grades, give them their grade 0s back. And then guess what? do it again. You can literally just sit there and continually beat them down until you essentially just win because they run out of resources. But that is why the stand triggers, guys, are good in this deck. When I said I had one more thing to say about them, it's essentially for when you go off with Reyes and you minus your opponent's Vanguard, even if it's 5,000, guys, that alone is critical. But if you can get a minus 10 on them, that's insane. And what you do is say before you Legion, hold on to this. Hold on to maybe a couple of these. So say your opponent only has one grade 0 on their board. So before you Legion, call, Soul Blast 2, get 2 more grade 0s on their board, then Legion, and sack a Witch. So now there's 3 grade 0s on their board, and they lose minus 15k on their opponent. Call, sack a Witch, minus 5k more, so their Vanguard is now -9. Good luck trying to defend that. So that's why this deck, guys, is just so deadly. It's essentially just going to beat your opponent down until they lose hand advantage and they can't counter out of it. These two Legions right here, they essentially they just go together so well because of they both there we go, because they just both they complement each other well. This is going to eat away your opponent's key units. Then when they decide, well, I can't replace all of them, so I got to leave one of those grade 0s so I don't lose too much hand, then you go to Reyes and punish them for it. So it's just insane how these two boss monsters go together. So anyway, guys, I hope this video helped you. So if you are wanting to build the witches, it kind of gives you a little maybe a couple of things that you need to think about when you're coming up with that deck list. If you do have any more questions on this deck or anything you want to ask me about it, I will be more than happy to answer it for you, so just leave it down in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Make sure you rate, comment, subscribe, thumbs up this video for me, and I'll see you next time.